Picture a ruler standing motionless as their greatest enemy is dragged before them, betrayal written across their face, fury burning in their eyes, and yet the ruler doesn't flinch. Not a flicker of anger, not a trace of satisfaction, just cold, calculated silence. This wasn't just power, it was mastery, because in the cutthroat world of royal courts, where whispers could topple empires and a single emotional slip could mean death, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword or a spy network. It was the ability to detach completely, to turn the human heart into an unreadable fortress. This is the forgotten art of emotional control, honed not by monks or philosophers, but by kings and queens who understood something profound. In the Game of Thrones, Stoicism wasn't just a philosophy, it was survival. Take Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal as barbarian armies gathered at Rome's borders. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. But this wasn't just self-help advice, it was battlefield strategy. While lesser rulers crumbled under stress or lashed out in rage, the Stoic emperor knew that emotions were vulnerabilities enemies could exploit. And history shows us the stakes. When Cleopatra's dramatic pleas swayed Mark Antony, it cost him an empire. When Elizabeth I refused to let heartbreak cloud her judgment, she outmaneuvered every rival. The difference between triumph and tragedy often came down to one skill: the ruthless discipline of emotional detachment. That's what we're uncovering today, how Stoic principles, meant to cultivate inner peace, became lethal tools in the hands of history's most cunning rulers. From the whispered corridors of Renaissance Italy to the blood-stained floors of the Roman Senate, we'll see how quotes like Seneca's, "A man's as miserable as he thinks he is," weren't just wisdom, they were psychological armor. Because when every smile could be a lie and every ally a future executioner, the real power belonged to those who could watch the game unfold without revealing they were even playing. Stick with me, and you'll discover how ancient techniques of self-mastery shaped the fate of nations, and what that means for navigating the hidden power struggles in your own life today. To understand why emotional detachment became such a devastating weapon in royal courts, we need to go back to the radical heart of Stoic philosophy. The ancient Stoics didn't just preach calm, they built an entire system around one revolutionary idea. Emotions aren't things that happen to us, but judgments we choose to accept. Epictetus, the former slave-turned-philosopher, drew a line that changed everything. Some things are within our power while others are not. Your thoughts, your reactions, your focus, those are yours to command. The actions of others, the whims of fate, even the rise and fall of kingdoms, those belong to the uncontrollable. For rulers surrounded by conspiracies, this wasn't just philosophy, it was the ultimate power play. Imagine a king receiving news that his closest advisor has been caught plotting against him. A lesser leader might erupt in rage, ordering executions in a fit of passion. But a Stoic ruler, they'd pause, dissecting the situation like a surgeon. Anger wouldn't cloud their judgment because they'd see it for what it was, a choice, not an inevitability. This wasn't about suppressing emotions, as modern caricatures of Stoicism suggest. It was about recognizing that every feeling is a response we can interrogate. Seneca put it bluntly, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." When Queen Elizabeth I learned of Mary, Queen of Scots' plots, she didn't act immediately. She waited, analyzed, and turned the situation into a strategic masterpiece because she governed her reactions before governing her realm. What made this approach so dangerous in royal courts was how it flipped traditional power dynamics. In an era where rulers were expected to display extravagant emotions, whether the unchecked wrath of Henry VIII or the theatrical grief of French monarchs, a leader who remained composed held an invisible advantage. They became unpredictable. Enemies couldn't manipulate them through flattery or provocation. This is why Marcus Aurelius spent years journaling reminders like, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." He wasn't advocating passivity, he was perfecting a form of psychological warfare. While rivals exhausted themselves with outbursts, the Stoic ruler conserved energy, observed patterns, and struck only when it served their goals. Modern audiences often mistake this detachment for coldness, but the distinction is crucial. Stoicism wasn't about erasing humanity, it was about mastering it. Catherine the Great, who kept Seneca's letters by her bedside, famously said, "I praise loudly, I blame softly." She felt deeply, but she decided when and how those feelings would influence her decisions. That's the real lesson history's most formidable rulers left us. Emotional control isn't the absence of power, it's power concentrated to its most lethal purity. And in the silent battles of court politics, that purity could determine who kept their head and who lost it literally. In the glittering halls of Byzantine palaces or the candlelit chambers of Tudor England, emotions weren't just personal, they were political landmines. Every sigh, every hesitation, every flicker of irritation could be weaponized against you. Picture the court of Empress Theodora, where a single tear shed at the wrong moment might embolden conspirators to whisper of instability. Or Henry VIII's England, where a nobleman's flushed face during an argument could mark him for the Tower. These weren't just social gatherings, they were psychological warfare zones where survival depended on reading rooms flawlessly while revealing nothing of your own hand. Consider the fate of Thomas Cromwell, once Henry VIII's most trusted advisor. His downfall began not with a failed policy, but with a momentary loss of composure, a heated argument witnessed by the wrong ears. Contrast that with the icy precision of Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who faced a rebellion that nearly burned Constantinople to the ground. While his advisors panicked, Justinian methodically assessed options without a single wasted emotion. His infamous words, "The purple makes the best shroud," weren't just bravado. They were the ultimate demonstration of detachment. Even death was just another variable to calculate. This constant scrutiny created a bizarre paradox. The more power someone held, the less freedom they had to feel. Queens like Catherine de' Medici maintained smiles during public humiliations, knowing any grimace would fuel enemy propaganda. When her son's troops massacred Protestant leaders, she famously hosted lavish balls that same evening, not from cruelty, but to project unshakable control. Because in royal courts, emotions weren't private experiences, they were currency. A king's grief could collapse his credit with foreign bankers. A princess's blush during marriage negotiations might lose her province. So let me ask you this, how long could you last in a world where every twitch of your eyebrow was analyzed for weakness, where laughter had to be timed strategically, and anger was a luxury only afforded to those with absolute power? That's why Stoic detachment wasn't just philosophical, it was the ultimate survival algorithm. While others drowned in their reactions, the greatest rulers treated emotions like chess pieces, to be moved deliberately or sacrificed without hesitation when the game demanded it. Marcus Aurelius faced more conspiracies before breakfast than most rulers encounter in a lifetime. Yet history remembers him not for paranoid outbursts, but for his eerie stillness. That stillness was his shield. While lesser emperors wasted energy hunting traitors, he wrote in his meditations, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice. This wasn't passive forgiveness, it was a calculated strategy. By refusing to react predictably to provocations, he transformed his composure into a psychological weapon. Take the revolt of Avidius Cassius, his most trusted general. When news reached Marcus that this right-hand man had declared himself emperor, his response was chilling in its restraint. Instead of dispatching assassins, he called a Senate meeting not to rage, but to calmly discuss whether Cassius should be pardoned if he surrendered. The message was clear: Marcus wasn't threatened because he refused to be threatened. His journal reveals the mindset: you always own the option of having no opinion. There is never any need to get worked up. By denying conspirators the satisfaction of seeing him rattled, he drained their plots of power. This approach disarmed rivals in ways brute force never could. When senators whispered behind his back, Marcus would invite them to elaborate their criticisms publicly, forcing them to either back down or reveal their hands. He turned stoic indifference into a mirror, exposing enemies' motives while his own remained obscured. Even during the Antonine Plague, when Rome lost thousands daily and some accused him of divine punishment, his response was methodical aid distribution rather than defensive fury. That unshakable focus on solutions over reactions made him nearly impossible to manipulate. The brilliance of his tactic lay in its simplicity. While other rulers built spy networks, Marcus built mental discipline. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, he wrote, meaning every emotional reaction was a choice to let external forces dictate his inner state. By treating betrayal as inconsequential as bad weather, he removed the incentive for courtiers to scheme. Why risk conspiring against someone who wouldn't even give you the drama of a dramatic downfall? Modern leaders still study his playbook. When tech CEOs face shareholder revolts or politicians handle smear campaigns, the wisest emulate Marcus's strategy, not suppressing emotions, but rendering them irrelevant to decision-making. Because whether in ancient Rome or a corporate boardroom, true power belongs to those who can watch chaos unfold without needing to prove they're in control. Seneca, the philosopher who shaped Nero's early reign, understood the razor's edge between emotional control and political survival better than most. His letters to the young emperor read like a masterclass in courtly deception, not through malice but necessity. Anger, he wrote, is like a ruin that crashes down upon what it would destroy. Yet for all his wisdom, Seneca's story ends not with triumph, but with a forced suicide ordered by his own pupil. This paradox reveals the dark truth about emotional detachment in power games. It can shield you, but never completely. Imagine advising history's most volatile ruler. While others flattered Nero's whims, Seneca taught him to pause before reacting, to see outbursts as luxuries lesser men couldn't afford. His writings brim with strategies we'd recognize today. Breathe before responding, reframe insults as irrelevant noise, view provocations as tests of will. When Nero demanded the execution of his own mother, it was Seneca who reportedly convinced him to stage a fake shipwreck, instead buying time to cool the emperor's rage. For years, this worked. Nero's early reign was surprisingly stable, a testament to Seneca's belief that no one is laughable who can laugh at themselves. But here's where the lesson twists. Seneca's downfall came not because his philosophy failed, but because he underestimated the one force no amount of stoicism can neutralize: pure, unchecked paranoia. As Nero grew more tyrannical, Seneca's calm demeanor stopped being an asset. His composed silence during executions was reinterpreted as secret disapproval. His refusal to participate in drunken palace orgies became evidence of disloyalty. The very detachment that had protected him now painted him as a threat. When the executioners arrived, even his death became a performance of Stoic ideals, bleeding out in a warm bath while dictating final thoughts to scribes. This begs an uncomfortable question: can emotional detachment ever backfire? The answer lies in recognizing its limits. Stoicism works best when your enemies still operate by rules, when they fear exposure or value reputation. But against someone like Nero, who reveled in chaos, Seneca's restraint became a liability. There's a chilling moment in his final letter where he admits, sometimes even to live is an act of courage. He wasn't just talking about personal hardship, he was confessing the grim reality that no philosophy can outmaneuver absolute madness. Modern leaders face similar traps. A CEO's calm during a scandal might project strength until shareholders decide it looks like indifference. A politician's refusal to engage with critics can seem dignified until voters perceive it as arrogance. The key isn't to abandon emotional control, but to wield it like Seneca initially did, as a flexible tool rather than an unbreakable rule. Because the hardest lesson from Rome isn't that Stoicism fails, it's that survival sometimes demands knowing when to drop the act and fight. Louis XI of France earned his nickname, the Spider King, not through grand speeches but through something far more unsettling: his ability to weaponize silence. While lesser rulers filled courtrooms with threats and boasts, Louis would simply watch, his expression as readable as stone. Ambassadors sent to negotiate with him reported sleepless nights, haunted by what he hadn't said. This was Stoic strategy distilled to its most potent form, the realization that words are currency and reckless spending makes you poor. History's most effective rulers understood that silence isn't passive, it's a tactical vacuum. When a nobleman once demanded justice for a perceived slight, Louis responded by staring at him for 3 agonizing minutes before turning to a servant to discuss the weather. The unspoken message was brutal: your grievance isn't even worth my breath. Compare this to modern leaders who tweet themselves into corners, or executives who undermine their authority by over-explaining during crises. The Stoic distinction is clear: speech reveals your position, but silence controls how others perceive theirs. The brilliance of this approach lies in its psychological asymmetry. In the French court, nobles would return from audiences with Louis clutching at shadows, dissecting every pause for hidden meaning. Had they offended him? Was he plotting? This uncertainty paralyzed his enemies more effectively than any army. Just as Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Silence is a lesson learned from the sufferings of many." Louis knew that human nature abhors unanswered questions, and that strategic silence forces others to fill the void with their own fears. Modern psychology confirms this ancient intuition. Studies on negotiation tactics show that the first person to break a silence typically concedes more ground. Yet today's leaders routinely surrender this advantage. Picture a corporate boardroom where an executive, unnerved by quiet, backtracks on demands simply to fill the air. Or politicians who sabotage their positions by responding to every provocation, ensuring their opponents always know which buttons to push. Louis's greatest trick was turning Stoic restraint into psychological theater. When informed of a rebellion, he'd deliberately delay response for weeks, not from indecision, but to let conspirators marinate in dread. By the time he acted, half had already turned themselves in. Contrast this with leaders who announce investigations the moment scandal breaks, robbing themselves of the leverage that comes with keeping others guessing. The lesson transcends time. Whether facing Renaissance courtiers or social media mobs, those who master silence control the narrative. Because when you refuse to dance to someone else's tempo, you force them to move to yours. And in that quiet space between stimulus and response, precisely where Stoics train us to pause, lies the power to unsettle empires. Tiberius, the second Roman emperor, perfected the art of wearing Stoic detachment like a mask, one that concealed calculations so cold, even his closest advisors couldn't discern truth from theater. Historians describe him listening to petitions with eyes half closed, face as expressive as marble, while secretly testing loyalties. When a senator once praised his wisdom, Tiberius responded with a sigh and silence, not from humility, but to see who would rush to amplify the flattery. This wasn't philosophy, it was psychological warfare disguised as restraint. The dark genius of such rulers lay in twisting Stoicism's principles into tools of deception. Where Marcus Aurelius used detachment to rise above pettiness, Tiberius weaponized it to provoke others into revealing themselves. He'd deliberately withhold reactions during treason trials, watching as the accused, unnerved by his silence, confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. Tacitus records how victims would beg for death just to escape the torment of his unreadable gaze. The lesson was brutal. When emotions are expected, their absence becomes a weapon. Elizabeth I employed a subtler version of this tactic. By maintaining regal composure while secretly encouraging rivals to expose their ambitions, she turned courtiers into self-destructive pawns. The Duke of Norfolk learned this too late. His conspiracy unraveled because Elizabeth's apparent indifference made him overconfident. "A prince's silence is the quicks, and where fools drown themselves," wrote Machiavelli, who understood that feigned detachment could lure enemies into fatal miscalculations. But here's the ethical dilemma. When does self-control cross into manipulation? Frederick the Great of Prussia offers a haunting case study. He publicly embraced Stoic ideals, writing essays on emotional discipline while secretly orchestrating false flag operations to justify wars. His famous quote, "A crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in," wasn't just witty humility. It was misdirection to make adversaries underestimate his ruthlessness. This forces us to confront Stoicism's shadow side. The same techniques that help leaders resist provocation can also sterilize empathy. When Catherine de' Medici coolly approved the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, her detachment wasn't wisdom, it was moral evasion. As psychologist Martha Nussbaum warns, emotions aren't just noise, they're ethical compasses. The line between discipline and dehumanization blurs when rulers train themselves not to feel. So we're left with a paradox. Emotional detachment can be both armor and poison. It protects against chaos but risks creating leaders who view people as variables. Perhaps the true test isn't whether a ruler can suppress emotions, but whether they retain the capacity to react when humanity demands it. Because history remembers Tiberius for his cruelty, not his control, proving that the greatest power lies not in mastering emotions, but in knowing when to let them speak. Musonius Rufus, the Stoic teacher who endured exile with the same calm most people reserve for a mild inconvenience, faced down slander with a simple yet devastating question. If someone handed you a gift and you refused to accept it, to whom does the gift belong? His point cuts deeper than ancient wisdom. It's a psychological master key. When false accusations fly, whether in imperial Rome or a modern election cycle, the power doesn't lie in the words themselves, but in our choice to treat them as currency worth exchanging. History's most resilient rulers understood this principle instinctively. When Byzantine Empress Irene faced rumors she'd poisoned her own son, she didn't issue frantic denials. She commissioned lavish public works projects, letting actions drown out whispers. Centuries later, George Washington confronted pamphlets accusing him of treason by hosting quiet dinners where critics could judge his character firsthand. Both grasped what modern politicians often forget. Reacting to slander doesn't disprove it, it validates its importance. Musonius took this further. teaching his students to actually welcome insults as training exercises. Just as fire tests gold, he argued, so does adversity test strong men. The modern smear campaign reveals why this approach remains lethal. Consider how seasoned operatives track opponents' reaction metrics. The more a target responds to baseless claims, the harder they're pushed. It's no accident that the politicians who weather scandals best often employ Stoic-adjacent tactics. When Angela Merkel faced false claims about her East German past, her infamous "no drama" response wasn't just personal style, it was strategic deprivation. By refusing to feed the outrage cycle, she starved the story of oxygen. But here's where most misinterpret Stoic resilience. It's not about bottling up anger or pretending words don't sting. The Stoic breakthrough was recognizing that insults only gain power through our cooperation. Seneca illustrated this by imagining a bystander mistaking a philosopher for a servant. The philosopher's amused response, "Well, you don't look like a fool either, yet here we are," reveals the game. Slander requires mutual participation. When Elizabeth I was called a heretic's bastard by Catholic Europe, she didn't send angry envoys, she had medals struck depicting herself as the biblical Judith holding a sword. The message, those who waste time refuting lies surrender the initiative to their enemies. This mental reframing transforms slander from a weapon to a diagnostic tool. Just as doctors learn more from fevers than perfect temperatures, leaders discover their true allies when storms hit. Marcus Aurelius noted how adversity shows people for what they are, far better than any loyalty test. Modern leaders facing cancel culture attacks might recognize the pattern. The colleagues who vanish at the first sign of trouble often weren't allies to begin with. The ultimate Stoic insight: what we call slander is really just noise until we decide to amplify it. When Teddy Roosevelt endured vicious newspaper lies during his presidency, he adopted a practice straight from Epictetus. Each morning, he'd place unopened hate mail in a drawer labeled "for later." By afternoon, the urge to respond had usually burned out with his morning coffee. The lesson transcends centuries. Emotional detachment isn't about suppressing reactions, but controlling their timing. And in that pause between insult and action lies the power to rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. Augustus Caesar once silenced an entire room with 4 words. When a senator groveled before him, listing divine comparisons and excessive praise, the emperor simply replied, "Let us be men." This wasn't modesty, it was psychological armor. In the toxic air of royal courts, where every compliment carried hidden barbs, Stoic rulers understood something dangerous. Flattery isn't just noise, it's slow-acting poison. The ancient Stoics classified praise as an indifferent, not inherently good or bad, but treacherous in its power to distort judgment. Like sugar coating a blade, pleasant words could make the cuts of manipulation painless until it was too late. Consider the fate of Emperor Valentinian I, whose love for theatrical flattery led him to promote unqualified generals, men who later collapsed Rome's northern defenses. Contrast that with Queen Elizabeth I's icy response to being called Gloriana by Parliament. Words are easy like the wind, faithful friends are hard to find. By rejecting the narcotic of praise, she forced courtiers to prove loyalty through action rather than hollow speeches. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus laid bare the trap. If someone told you that a certain person spoke ill of you, don't bother making excuses, just reply, "He must not know my other faults, or he would have mentioned those too." This wasn't self-deprecation, it was immunization. Against ego's vulnerabilities, the cunning part, flattery, works precisely because it feels harmless. Modern neuroscience shows compliments trigger the same dopamine pathways as financial rewards, making us biologically predisposed to crave them. Ancient rulers exploited this weakness ruthlessly. Byzantine emperors kept professional flatterers called silentiaries to test officials' reactions to praise. If a governor preened at being called the new Alexander, he'd soon find himself reassigned to some frozen frontier. True power belonged to those like Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be." B1. His refusal to engage with praise created an unassailable reputation because when you don't need validation, no one can use it to control you. Here's the challenge lurking beneath the history. We're all susceptible. Maybe it's the coworker who laughs too hard at your jokes before asking for favors. Or the relative who gushes over your success right before borrowing money. The psychological mechanism is identical to what brought down kings, the human craving to be seen as exceptional. Seneca saw through it. When someone boasts about how often they've been insulted, they're really boasting about how often they've been praised. So try this experiment for one day. Track every compliment you receive, not to revel in them, but to notice their timing. Who stands to gain from your inflated self-image? Because the ultimate Stoic power move isn't rejecting flattery outright. It's recognizing it as currency in a game you don't have to play. As Augustus proved, real authority begins when you stop needing to be called divine. The Stoics didn't eliminate anger, they mastered its timing. Seneca's treatise on anger reveals the razor's edge, between Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, and tactical fury. No plague has cost the human race more dearly, yet rightly used, even anger can serve virtue. This paradox defined history's most formidable rulers. Take Henry VII, the Tudor king who built his reign on icy calculation, yet whose rare theatrical outbursts became precision strikes. When false pretenders challenged his throne, Henry would erupt in carefully staged rages, pounding tables and vowing vengeance. But watch closely, these weren't emotional collapses. They were performances designed to achieve three ruthless objectives: terrify enemies into surrender, rally allies through shared outrage, and most crucially, conceal his true strategic patience. Seneca anticipated this exact tactic. The wise man will use anger, not be used by it. He distinguished between the involuntary flush of rage and the deliberate adoption of anger's energy. Like a surgeon sterilizing a scalpel, Stoic rulers purified anger of its unpredictability, wielding it only when the cost-benefit analysis justified the spectacle. Henry's genius lay in making his outbursts so infrequent that when they came, their shock value paralyzed opponents. Contrast this with his predecessor Richard III, whose constant temper tantrums made his anger predictable and therefore useless as a tool. The psychological mechanics here are brutally modern. Neuroscience confirms that humans instinctively mirror strong emotions in others, meaning a king's controlled rage could trigger panic in rivals before a single soldier was mobilized. When Holy Roman Emperor Charles V learned French troops had crossed into Italy, he didn't immediately retaliate. He waited 3 weeks, then unleashed a screaming fit during a packed diplomatic banquet. The delayed reaction made it seem spontaneous, when in reality, every curse had been rehearsed. His ambassadors later reported enemy commanders suddenly offering concessions, fearing his uncontrolled wrath. But the true Stoic test came after these performances. Seneca warned that false anger must never be allowed to become real. Prolonged anger turns to madness. Henry VII proved this by immediately reverting to stone-faced calm once his goals were achieved. After terrifying the Earl of Warwick's supporters with a public meltdown, records show he spent that same evening playing chess with his treasurer discussing tax reforms without a trace of agitation. This discipline separated tactical anger from self-destructive emotion. Modern leaders still employ variations of this playbook. Watch courtroom footage of great trial attorneys who suddenly lose their temper at precisely the moment jurors need emotional guidance. Or CEOs who stage calculated outbursts during union negotiations to shift power dynamics. The lesson transcends centuries. Anger is only a weakness when it controls you. In the hands of a Stoic strategist, it becomes another variable in the equation of power, deployed like a controlled demolition, then contained before the fallout spreads. The chilling takeaway: what we mistake for raw emotion in history's great rulers was often performance art. When Catherine the Great flew into a rage upon hearing of her son's treasonous letters, her ladies-in-waiting noted she never actually spilled her tea. Because, as Seneca observed, true power lies not in feeling nothing, but in deciding precisely when to let others think you've lost control. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she staged it. Every pale face powdered to marble perfection, every rustling gown of unblemished white, every carefully crafted speech dripping with calculated restraint. This wasn't just a queen, but a masterpiece of Stoic theater. Her Virgin Queen persona wasn't about chastity, it was psychological armor. By removing herself from the messy realm of human desire, she became untouchable, not because she lacked passion, but because she refused to let Europe's power brokers predict her moves. In an age where royal marriages were chess games played with living pawns, Elizabeth's performative detachment forced kings and suitors to chase a ghost. This art of crafting a public facade traces straight back to Stoicism's core paradox. True control often means controlling what others see. Marcus Aurelius wrote his most personal reflections in Greek, a language most Roman elites couldn't read, while presenting an impenetrable Latin mask to the Senate. The difference between ancient rulers and modern celebrities: scale, not strategy. Today's influencers and CEOs meticulously curate social media personas to project unflappable confidence, just as Renaissance princes commissioned portraits showing them in states of serene authority. The psychology remains identical. Uncertainty breeds influence. When Elon Musk tweets cryptic jokes about bankruptcy during Tesla's turbulent weeks, or Taylor Swift releases lyrics hinting at hidden grievances while smiling through award shows, they're playing the same game Elizabeth did, letting audiences project meaning onto their blank slates. What made the Stoic mask so devastating in politics was its fluidity. Catherine de' Medici could weep publicly over a murdered ally while secretly drafting assassination orders because her tears weren't lies but tools. Modern parallels abound. Watch a press conference where a politician acknowledges scandal with somber nods instead of defensive rage, and you'll see the same principle. Emotions are most powerful when their authenticity can't be pinned down. Angela Merkel's infamous poker face during the Eurozone crisis wasn't just personal reserve, it forced other leaders to negotiate against a void. The danger, of course, comes when persona consumes the person. Just as Instagram influencers sometimes lose themselves in their manufactured online identities, historical figures risked becoming prisoners of their own performances. Philip II of Spain took Stoic impassivity so far that his courtiers reportedly checked his pulse during executions to confirm he was still alive. That's the tightrope walk, using detachment as a shield without letting it hollow you out. Perhaps that's why Elizabeth I's most revealing moment came in private, when she allegedly whispered, "To be a king and wear a crown is more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasure to them that bear it." Even the architects of these facades understood the cost, so the next time you see a leader, a celebrity, or even a colleague maintaining unreadable calm under pressure, look closer. That blank expression might not be the absence of strategy, but the ultimate expression of it, because whether in the glittering courts of the 16th century or the boardrooms of today, power belongs to those who can make the world wonder what's really behind the mask. Death came not as an interruption, but as the final examination in Stoic philosophy, a test administered with brutal fairness to emperors and slaves alike. Consider the last night of Seneca's life, when Nero's soldiers ordered his suicide. Rather than pleading or panicking, the philosopher called for scribes to take dictation on mortality, turning his own bleeding wrists into a classroom. Across Rome, elite families would later recite his final words like sacred texts. Why weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears. This wasn't just courage, it was performance art designed to teach the ultimate lesson, that even when stripped of power, wealth, and breath itself, a disciplined mind remains unshackled. The chilling brilliance of such exits lay in their calculated pedagogy. When Socrates drank hemlock, his disciples expected anguish or at least solemnity. Instead, he critiqued the taste, joked about offering a libation to the gods, and gently reminded his students to repay a rooster he owed. Centuries later, Roman nobles reenacted this scene during their own executions, not as blind imitation, but because they'd grasped the strategy. By treating death as casually as a dinner conversation, these Stoics exposed the fragility of their executioner's power. What terror remains when the condemned refuse to perform fear? History preserves these moments like frozen lightning. Byzantine General Belisarius, blinded and begging in Constantinople's streets, was said to murmur, "Thus falls the man who thought himself indispensable." King Charles I of England, stepping onto his execution scaffold in January frost, handed his fur cloak to a bishop with the quip, "Give this to someone who actually trembles." Even Mussolini's mistress, Claretta Petocci, reportedly faced the partisan firing squad with a sneer, "Show me how men die," though she'd never studied philosophy. The pattern reveals a universal truth. In extremity, humans don't rise to occasion, but fall to their most practiced level of training. Modern psychology confirms what ancient rulers intuited. Studies on hospice patients show those who have contemplated mortality regularly, not with morbidity, but clarity, experience less existential terror in their final days. The Stoic premeditatio malorum exercise wasn't about pessimism, it was cognitive vaccination. By mentally rehearsing loss, exile, even death, practitioners like Marcus Aurelius could face real crises with eerie poise. His meditations read like a man preparing for his own autopsy. Soon you'll be ashes or bones, a mere name at best, and even that just a sound, an echo. Yet here's the twist: these historical accounts often omit the quiet desperation behind the performance. Seneca's wife Paulina attempted suicide with him, not out of Stoic devotion, but unbearable grief. When executioners pulled her bleeding body away, Seneca's famous composure cracked for the first time. He begged them to spare her, his voice breaking proof that even philosophy's grand masters remained human. This duality matters more than any deathbed quote, because Stoicism's real power wasn't erasing emotion, but choosing which one served a purpose greater than fear. So let's return to that unsettling question: what would fill your mind if the clock turned final? Not as hypothetical musing, but as the Stoics framed it, a daily rehearsal. Not morbid obsession, but the quiet acknowledgement that every conversation could be your last argument, every parting kiss a permanent farewell. Because the true test of detachment isn't how calmly you face death when it arrives, it's how fully you engage with life, knowing it's already slipping through your fingers. And perhaps that's the most subversive lesson of all, that by staring unflinchingly at endings, we might finally learn how to begin. Marcus Aurelius kept a private journal not for posterity, but for precision. Amidst wars and plagues, his ink-stained pages circled back to one obsession: Concentrate every minute like a Roman on doing what's in front of you with strict and straightforward dignity. This wasn't spiritual advice, it was the ultimate productivity hack for rulers drowning in chaos. While modern leaders toggle between 20 browser tabs and crisis alerts, the Stoics engineered mental clarity through ruthless present-moment focus. The emperor's morning ritual set the tone. He'd visualize his day as already complete, rehearsing interruptions before they occurred. By preempting distractions, he created what psychologists now call cognitive load capacity, the mental bandwidth to handle sudden revolts or famines without decision fatigue. Contrast this with today's leadership landscape. Neuroscience reveals the average executive makes one decision every 9 minutes, fracturing attention into useless shards. Ancient rulers faced higher stakes with far fewer tools, no emergency video conferences, no real-time intelligence feeds. Their advantage, Stoic temporal discipline. When Persian envoys demanded immediate answers from Spartan king Agesilaus, he deliberately delayed response for 3 days, not from indecision, but to demonstrate that urgency was a construct his mind refused to acknowledge. Modern experiments confirm this approach. Executives who batch decisions into focused blocks outperform reactive peers by staggering margins. The Roman military even institutionalized this principle. Officers were trained to pause for exactly 12 breaths before issuing battlefield commands, not just to calm nerves, but to reset temporal perception under stress. Here's where Stoic time management becomes actionable. Try what historians call the monk mode exercise. For 1 week, segment your day like a medieval monastery. Dawn hours for deep strategy. Marcus wrote his meditations at first light. Midday for measured responses. Byzantine emperors held audiences only after noon, when petitioners' emotions cooled. Twilight for reflection. Seneca reviewed each evening with 3 questions. What did I control? Where did I react poorly? What requires tomorrow's focus? The goal isn't rigidity, it's designing temporal architecture that forces presence. The psychological payoff is profound. fMRI scans show that when humans concentrate on single tasks, the prefrontal cortex operates with military efficiency. Multitasking, by contrast, lights up the brain like a pinball machine, which explains why Emperor Hadrian could adjudicate legal cases for 8 hours straight, while modern CEOs report 6 productive hours per week. The difference lies in treating time not as something to fill, but as a forge to temper focus. So consider this: your calendar isn't a ledger of meetings, but a training ground for Stoic awareness. When Marcus wrote, "You could leave life right now, let that determine what you do and say and think," he wasn't being morbid. He was installing a mental failsafe against procrastination and distraction. Because rulers who master minutes don't just manage time, they bend history to their will. Emperor Hadrian built walls, not just the famous one in Britain, but invisible ones around his own heart. When his young lover Antinous drowned in the Nile, the most powerful man in the ancient world refused all public mourning. No statues, no poetic elegies, just stone-faced silence as he threw himself into administrative reforms. To observers, it seemed like Stoic mastery, but scrolls discovered centuries later told a darker story: sleepless nights spent wandering palace halls, secret letters confessing, the wound never closes. Here lies the paradox no Stoic text adequately addresses. Detachment isn't armor if it cages the very humanity that makes you human. Epictetus, who praised emotional resilience, also warned against this trap. Don't seek to have everything that happens happen as you wish, but wish for everything to happen as it actually does. At first glance, it sounds like surrender, but the Greek word he uses, proherses, implies active engagement with reality, not numb avoidance. Hadrian missed this nuance. By refusing to process grief, he didn't transcend it, he let it fester. Within months, his famed rationality began crumbling. Paranoid purges of senators, erratic military campaigns, even attempting suicide. The lesson: emotional detachment works like antibiotics, vital in controlled doses, disastrous when overused. Modern psychology confirms what ancient courts witnessed. Studies on alexithymia, the inability to identify emotions, show suppressed feelings don't vanish. They metastasize. Brain scans of executives praised for ice-cold decision-making reveal alarming patterns, atrophied empathy circuits, hyperactive threat responses. It's no coincidence that Hadrian's worst tyrannies coincided with his most extreme emotional repression. The same man who once pardoned rebels later ordered torture sessions for minor dissent. Why? Because numbing pain also numbs conscience. This raises a brutal question for our poll today. When does detachment stop being strength and start becoming sickness? Consider two rulers facing identical betrayals. King Louis XI of France channeled fury into strategic patience, waiting years to dismantle traitors methodically. But Russia's Tsar Paul I, who prided himself on feeling nothing, descended into such erratic violence that his own son approved his assassination. The difference wasn't philosophy, it was balance. So where's the line? The Stoics never advocated emotional amputation. Marcus Aurelius wept openly for his dead children while maintaining state affairs. Seneca wrote tenderly about friendship's joys between lessons on resilience. Their wisdom recognized a truth modern leaders often forget. True control means choosing when to engage with emotions, not erasing them entirely. Hadrian's tragedy wasn't that he loved too deeply, but that he denied himself the right to grieve, turning the very philosophy that should have healed him into a prison of his own making. Perhaps the ultimate test of Stoic detachment isn't how much we can endure, but how honestly we acknowledge what endurance costs us, because walls built to keep out pain eventually starve the heart of everything else. And history shows no empire, external or internal, can thrive on emptiness. Stoic alliances weren't built on flattery or fear, but on something far more durable: mutual self-interest, stripped of emotional baggage. Consider Marcus Aurelius and his rival Cassius, the general who betrayed him. When Cassius's rebellion collapsed, Marcus didn't execute his family or burn his letters. He publicly returned both with a single line: they acted out of loyalty, not treason. This wasn't mercy, it was strategic calculus. By demonstrating that loyalty to him carried no downside, even for enemies' kin, he turned potential adversaries into reluctant allies overnight. The Stoic approach to relationships hinged on a radical premise: trust is more reliable when it's transactional, not emotional. Machiavelli would have scoffed at this. In The Prince, he warned rulers to choose between being feared or loved, dismissing half measures as dangerous, but the Stoics operated on a different frequency. They understood that fear breeds silent plotters, while love creates unrealistic expectations. Instead, they cultivated what Seneca called amicitia utilis, useful friendships. These weren't cold calculations, but bonds where both parties acknowledged the practical foundation beneath the camaraderie. When the philosopher met with wealthy patrons, he never pretended their relationship was anything but symbiotic. You gain wisdom from my words, I gain security from your roof. This clarity created astonishingly resilient networks. Byzantine Emperor Justinian's partnership with his general Belisarius thrived not through blind trust, but precisely because both men acknowledged the terms. Belisarius received glory and wealth, Justinian gained military victories. When rumors later accused the general of ambition, Justinian didn't erupt in paranoid rage. He simply adjusted the incentives, offering greater rewards for continued loyalty. Contrast this with King Henry VIII, whose emotional dependence on advisors like Thomas More led to alternating extremes of worship and execution. The journal prompt hidden in these histories is uncomfortably relevant today. Scan your own relationships, which thrive on genuine reciprocity and which depend on unspoken debts or emotional manipulation. Stoics would argue the former liberate both parties while the latter become cages. Epictetus framed it bluntly: if someone brings you harm, that's their problem. But if you keep trusting someone who harms you, that's yours. Modern psychology validates this ancient insight. Studies on workplace alliances show transactional teams where roles and benefits are explicitly defined outperform family-style groups when crises hit. Why? Because clarity survives stress, ambiguity fuels resentment. The Stoic twist was recognizing that transparency about mutual benefit doesn't diminish connection, it purifies it. When Catherine the Great negotiated with Voltaire, their letters dripped with mutual admiration and frank acknowledgments that she needed his intellectual credibility while he desired her protection. So here's the uncomfortable exercise. Take a blank page and draw 2 columns. In the first, list relationships where expectations are unspoken. In the second, those where terms are openly understood. The Stoics would bet their libraries that the second group feels lighter, yet lasts longer. Because in courts or corporate offices, the alliances that endure aren't built on hidden hopes, but on the unglamorous foundation of clearly stated needs and the freedom to walk away if the balance shifts. The Byzantine envoy didn't flinch when the barbarian king threw a goblet against the wall, splattering wine like blood across the marble. While lesser diplomats might have recoiled or scrambled to placate the outburst, this envoy simply adjusted his robe and continued speaking in the same measured tone. That unshakable calm wasn't just professionalism, it was a psychological battering ram. Because in high-stakes negotiations, whether 7th century peace treaties or modern mergers, the party that controls their reactions controls the room. The Stoics called this mental fortress the inner citadel, not just a metaphor, but a tactical advantage forged through disciplined perception. Byzantine emperors elevated this principle to an art form. Their diplomats were trained to treat negotiations as chess matches where emotions were pieces to be sacrificed. When Emperor Justinian sent envoys to Persia, their instructions included a chilling detail. No matter what insults the Persian king hurled, they were to smile slightly and ask if he needed water to continue. This wasn't mockery, it was strategic psychology. By refusing to mirror the opponent's emotional state, they forced the Persians to either escalate into absurdity or recalibrate to the Byzantines' calm wavelength. Modern hostage negotiators use identical tactics. When FBI agents maintain monotone voices during ransom demands, they're not suppressing emotions. They're weaponizing emotional consistency to destabilize volatile counterparts. The brilliance lies in the asymmetry. While emotional negotiators reveal their priorities through frustration or eagerness, the Stoic approach turns blankness into a mirror. Venetian merchants documented this during tense trade talks with Constantinople. The Byzantine officials would pause for precisely 12 seconds after each offer, not out of indecision, but to make the Venetians sweat. Inevitably, the merchants would fill the silence with concessions, misreading stillness as dissatisfaction. Harvard Business School studies now confirm this ancient intuition. Negotiators who extend pauses by just 3 seconds secure better terms nearly 70% of the time. Silence, it turns out, is the ultimate bargaining chip, but the inner citadel's real power emerges during outright hostility. When Holy Roman Emperor Charles V threatened to invade Rome unless the Pope bowed to his demands, the papal envoy didn't plead or protest. He yawned. Then he remarked that invading armies tended to melt in Italian summers. Perhaps His Majesty might prefer autumn for his tantrum. The calculated nonchalance achieved what no counterthreat could. It reframed the entire negotiation. Suddenly, Charles wasn't a fearsome emperor issuing ultimatums. He was a petulant child being humored. The eventual treaty terms heavily favored the Vatican. Modern dealmakers inherit this legacy. Elon Musk's infamous counteroffer of $0 during Twitter negotiations wasn't just frugality, it was a masterclass in stoic leverage. By demonstrating utter indifference to the deal's collapse, he flipped the power dynamic. Similarly, when pharmaceutical executives face congressional grillings, the ones who survive unscathed aren't those with perfect answers, but those who maintain the same mild tone whether discussing drug prices or lunch plans. Their composure becomes a shield no accusation can penetrate. The lesson transcends centuries. Negotiation isn't about the terms on the table, but the psychological terrain beneath them. Build your inner citadel strong enough, and you'll find opponents start climbing your walls to meet you. Not because you demanded it, but because you gave them nowhere else to stand. Catherine de' Medici didn't just play the game of power, she rewrote its rules by weaponizing the very stereotypes meant to undermine her. When French nobles dismissed her tearful outbursts as hysterical feminine weakness, they missed the calculated precision behind each performance. Those tears were never about losing control. They were smoke screens for ruthless maneuvers. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre planning, Catherine famously wept while signing execution orders, letting male advisors mistake her distress for reluctance. By morning, her emotional indecision had lured Protestant leaders into a fatal sense of security. This was Stoic detachment in its most subversive form, using gendered expectations as camouflage while operating with ice-cold logic. History is littered with queens who turned emotional stereotypes into strategic leverage. Elizabeth I mastered the art of the calculated swoon, collapsing theatrically when pressured about marriage, only to recover moments later with demands for new trade treaties. Her contemporaries called it the Virgin's frailty, but her private letters reveal the truth. They expect vapors and fainting, so I give them a performance worthy of their prejudice. Even Cleopatra, often reduced to the seductress archetype, employed deliberate emotional displays as geopolitical tools. When she famously rolled herself out of a carpet before Caesar, it wasn't just flirtation. It was a calibrated demonstration of vulnerability designed to trigger his protective instincts. Modern psychology would recognize this as high-stakes emotional framing. By controlling how others perceive her emotional state, she controlled their responses. The brilliance of these strategies lies in their psychological jujitsu. While male rulers like Louis XIV cultivated images of unshakable rationality, female leaders navigated a double bind, too stoic, and they were labeled unnatural, too expressive, and they were deemed unfit to rule. Catherine de' Medici resolved this by creating a persona that oscillated between extremes. One moment she'd weep over a minor slight, the next she'd coldly order the poisoning of a rival. This unpredictability wasn't instability. It was a forced reset on her opponent's cognitive frameworks. Like a chess player who suddenly changes strategies mid-game, she exploited the confusion caused by defying categorization. Neuroscience now explains why this worked so well. Studies on expectation violation theory show that when people encounter behavior that contradicts stereotypes, like a crying woman who then executes flawless political maneuvers, their brains actually pause to recalibrate. That split-second cognitive dissonance creates a power vacuum, and the most disciplined mind fills it. Elizabeth exploited this when she addressed her troops at Tilbury in full armor. By combining martial imagery with references to her weak and feeble woman's body, she triggered both admiration and protective loyalty simultaneously. The effect was electric. Soldiers reportedly wept while pledging to die for her. Yet the real lesson here transcends gender. Modern leaders of all identities can learn from these queens' mastery of perception management. When a young CEO leans into inexperienced enthusiasm to extract mentoring from veterans before outmaneuvering them, or when an underestimated employer uses self-deprecating humor to disguise their ambition, they're employing the same principles. The common thread isn't femininity, it's the strategic use of others' assumptions as leverage. As Catherine wrote in a secret letter to her daughter, they will paint you as emotional while they bleed from wounds you gave them without their noticing. Perhaps that's the ultimate Stoic insight these queens embodied. True control isn't about suppressing emotions or identities, but deciding precisely when and how to deploy them. Because in the end, the ruler who can make others believe they hold the advantage often wins without drawing a sword, just by letting their opponents underestimate the mind behind the mask. Napoleon's quill scratched across the paper in his damp exile cell, each stroke a study in brutal self-awareness. Circumstances, what are circumstances? I make circumstances, he'd once boasted at the height of his power. Now, stripped of empire and army, he wrote with startling clarity, "There is no such thing as an accident, it is fate misnamed." This wasn't resignation, it was Stoic recalibration. On St. Helena, the man who'd redrawn Europe's map turned his strategic mind inward, dissecting his downfall not as tragedy, but as data. Where lesser men would have crumbled into bitterness, Napoleon treated exile as his final campaign, analyzing every misstep with the detachment of a general reviewing battle plans. His journals reveal eerie echoes of Marcus Aurelius. The obstacle becomes the way when you accept what can't be changed and exploit what remains. History's deposed rulers offer masterclasses in this paradoxical strength. When Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was overthrown by barbarians in 476, his conqueror Odoacer didn't execute him, he pensioned him off to a villa. Contemporaries expected shame or suicide. Instead, the boy emperor spent his days gardening and studying philosophy, reportedly telling visitors, "I've traded a crown for sunlight on my face and no knives at my back." Modern psychologists would recognize this as radical acceptance, the Stoic practice of reframing losses as voluntary exchanges. Marcus Aurelius had prefigured it centuries earlier. Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been. The chilling brilliance of these responses lies in their psychological alchemy. Byzantine Empress Irene, blinded and imprisoned by her own son, turned her dungeon into a salon where guards smuggled in books. Swedish Queen Christina abdicated voluntarily, moved to Rome, and surrounded herself with artists and scientists, her letters revealing she'd engineered her own downfall to escape the gilded cage of monarchy. These weren't surrenders but strategic retreats, proving Seneca's dictum. Sometimes even to live is an act of courage. Here's where Stoicism transcends history books. That promotion you didn't get, the relationship that ended, the business venture that failed, these are micro-exiles, moments when life deposes us from our imagined thrones. The Stoic move isn't pretending it doesn't sting, but asking Napoleon's exile question. What can I build from these ruins? When Microsoft acquired Nokia's failing mobile division, ousted CEO Stephen Elop quoted Marcus Aurelius in his farewell memo. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Within years, he'd leveraged that failure into a senior role at Australian telecom giant Telstra. The ultimate lesson from history's fallen crowns is this: defeat only becomes permanent when we insist it shouldn't have happened. Richard II, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle after Henry Bolingbroke's coup, spent his final days composing poetry about the freedom found in accepting powerlessness, verses that later inspired Shakespeare. Compare that to modern executives who rage against market shifts or creatives paralyzed by rejection. The Stoic alternative: treat every loss like Roman generals treated captured territories, not as endings, but as new borders from which to regroup. Because resilience isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about learning to land in a way that leaves you ready to rise. The streets of Renaissance Venice crawled with shadows, not just from flickering torches, but from men who mastered the art of becoming them. These weren't ordinary spies, they were living experiments in Stoic detachment, trained to navigate treasonous alleys with the same calm as monks in meditation. Take Antonio Gramsci, a lesser-known operative for the Venetian Council of Ten. His cipher reports reveal a chilling methodology. Before each mission, he'd spend hours mentally rehearsing capture, torture, even execution. By the time he slipped into enemy palaces, fear was just another variable he'd already calculated. This wasn't bravado, it was cognitive inoculation. Modern neuroscience confirms the technique. When subjects visualize worst-case scenarios in detail, their amygdala shows 40% less activation during real crises. The Stoic spies of Florence and Constantinople were hacking stress responses centuries before brain scans existed. Compare this to today's cybersecurity warriors. In underground forums, elite hackers describe identical mental frameworks during high-stakes breaches. One anonymous operative recounted disabling a hostile server while SWAT teams surrounded his apartment, his focus anchored by repeating Marcus Aurelius's mantra, "The obstacle is the way." The parallel isn't coincidental. Renaissance spies and modern cyber operatives face the same psychological battlefield: overwhelming uncertainty, delayed feedback, and consequences that could explode without warning. The difference: while Renaissance agents risked the rack and Iron Maiden, today's digital spies face existential dread of doxing or indefinite detention. Yet the optimal mindset remains unchanged. A NATO cybersecurity handbook recently incorporated Epictetus's Enchiridion, teaching analysts to treat system breaches like Stoics viewed barbarian invasions events to be managed, not feared. The brilliance of these detached operatives lay in their emotional economy. Francesco Guicciardini, a Medici-era spymaster, kept a ledger not just of gold paid to informants, but of emotional expenditures. His agents were graded on their ability to absorb provocations without reaction, a skill modern intelligence agencies now quantify. During CIA training exercises, recruits lose points for visible frustration during interrogation simulations. The lesson transcends centuries. A spy who flinches at taunts or preens at praise becomes a marionette for enemy manipulators. That's why Mossad's most effective deep-cover operatives train by watching their own families fake obituaries, not to deaden empathy, but to ensure it never overrides mission parameters. Yet there's a razor's edge between detachment and recklessness. Renaissance archives contain cautionary tales like The Fool of Ferrara, a spy whose overconfidence in his Stoic training led to sloppy tradecraft. He'd walk into enemy courts without contingency plans, believing philosophy alone would suffice. His severed head ended up on a pike outside Milan's gates, a grisly reminder that detachment must be paired with meticulous preparation. Modern cybersecurity teams echo this balance through Red Team, exercises where hackers simulate catastrophe scenarios. The goal isn't to suppress stress hormones, but to redirect them into hyperfocus, what Navy SEAL call stress inoculation. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in extraction protocols. When Venetian spies were compromised, their handlers didn't send rescue parties. they activated prearranged cognitive exits. Agents had memorized Seneca's letters about impermanence, enabling them to face capture with eerie composure. Today, corporate cybersecurity teams employ similar psychological prep. Before infiltrating hacker forums, undercover researchers script their own mental exit ramps of visualizing worst-case exposures while repeating Epictetus's reminder. It's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. This leaves us with a provocative question. In an era where digital espionage shapes global power more than Venetian daggers ever did, are we training operatives' minds as rigorously as their technical skills? The Renaissance answer would be clear. A spy's greatest weapon isn't a cipher or a keystroke logger. It's the ability to watch their own potential downfall with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. And that's a skill no algorithm can replicate. The banquet hall glittered with excess goblets overflowing, roast peacocks stuffed with live birds that burst forth in a spectacle of feathers, guests slumped over tables in drunken stupor. And then there was Emperor Augustus nibbling a single fig while watching the chaos unfold. This wasn't just personal restraint, it was psychological dominance. In royal courts where feasts were theaters of power, the ruler who ate least often ruled most. The Stoics understood what modern science now confirms. Moderation isn't just virtuous, it's a strategic advantage. Seneca's letters to Lucilius crackle with warnings about indulgence. A man who dines in moderation cannot be controlled through his appetites. He might as well have been writing a manual for medieval kings. Take the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts hosted by Caesar Borgia. While cardinals gorged on decadent dishes, Borgia himself ate sparingly, then calmly announced he just poisoned the wine. The real toxin, his guests' own gluttony, had made them vulnerable. Contrast this with Louis XIV's Versailles, where nobles competed to consume 60-course meals. The Sun King's trick, he'd often rise from the table after a few bites, forcing his courtiers to abandon their plates mid-meal. Their discomfort wasn't accidental. It was a calculated reminder that even their digestion depended on his whims. The physiological power play here is fascinating. When you eat lightly among indulgers, you create cognitive dissonance. Neuroscience shows that observing someone resist temptation triggers the prefrontal cortex's self-evaluation circuits, essentially holding up a mirror to others' lack of control. Byzantine Emperor Basil II exploited this during negotiations with Bulgar envoys. While they drowned in wine, he sipped water and watched their secrets spill. By dawn, he'd extracted concessions they barely remembered giving. This raises an uncomfortable question. How much leverage do we surrender through casual indulgence? Modern executives might recognize the dynamic in boardroom lunches, where the person ordering salad while others devour steak often controls the meeting's tempo. Silicon Valley titans like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos famously favor sparse meals during negotiations, not for health, but to maintain metabolic and mental edge. So here's the challenge hidden in Seneca's advice. Host your own Stoic dinner. Invite friends to a lavish spread, then eat 1/3 of what they do. Observe how discomfort shifts around the table. Notice who jokes nervously about your restraint, who mimics your portions, who doubles down on excess. Because whether in Renaissance palaces or modern restaurants, consumption isn't just about sustenance, it's a silent declaration of who governs their impulses and who gets governed by them. The true test of Stoic dining isn't resisting the feast, but sitting at its heart while remaining unmistakably free. Marcus Aurelius ended his days not with wine or revelry, but with ink-stained fingers and deliberate reflection. His private writings reveal a nightly ritual that modern science now confirms as neurological gold, a structured wind-down combining gratitude, self-assessment, and preemptive problem-solving. While lesser rulers drowned anxieties in excess, the philosopher-emperor would retire early, light a single lamp, and methodically review his day through 3 Stoic lenses. What did I control today? Where did I surrender my reason? What must I release before sleep? This wasn't journaling, it was cognitive housekeeping. Neuroscientists studying high-performance executives have found that individuals who practice similar evening reflections exhibit 23% deeper slow-wave sleep, the phase critical for memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Contrast this with today's power brokers guzzling melatonin while scanning disaster emails at midnight. Silicon Valley's obsession with hustle culture has normalized sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, a far cry from the Stoic understanding that true leadership requires a rested mind. Consider Elon Musk admitting to Ambien-fueled tweet storms or Wall Street traders collapsing during mergers after 70-hour binges. The irony: ancient rulers faced existential threats daily yet prioritized rest as strategic discipline. Byzantine Emperor Basil II famously napped before battles, telling aides, "A tired general loses more empires than a weak one." Modern studies on decision fatigue confirm his intuition. Sleep-deprived CEOs make riskier bets and misread opponents' intentions at alarming rates. Here's how to adapt Marcus's ritual for modern power players. First, the gratitude interrogation. List 3 specific actions where you exercised control, no matter how small. Not had a good meeting, but redirected the conversation when it veered into gossip. Next, the humility audit. Identify one moment emotion overrode reason, perhaps snapping at an assistant when stress was really about a client's email. Finally, the detachment exercise. Visualize tomorrow's challenges as already resolved. When Marcus wrote, "The cucumber is bitter, throw it away, there are brambles in the path." Go around, he wasn't being glib, he was rehearsing adaptability. The physiological magic lies in sequencing. By addressing gratitude first, you activate the brain's reward pathways, lowering cortisol. The humility assessment engages the prefrontal cortex without triggering defensiveness, like a coach reviewing game footage rather than berating players. And the detachment visualization works as a mental rehearsal, reducing next-day anxiety spikes. FBI hostage negotiators use a similar 3-step debrief to prevent burnout after crises. Your journal template should take exactly 12 minutes, the time researchers at Stanford found optimal for reflection without rumination. Keep it analog. The act of handwriting engages motor memory differently than typing. Use red ink for the humility section. Studies show color coding enhances recall of corrective behaviors, and always close with Marcus's question, "Have I been a good citizen of my own mind tonight?" Because in the silent hours when others are numbing themselves with screens or scotch, the true Stoic is already preparing tomorrow's victories, one examined thought at a time. Frederick the Great of Prussia once rode unarmed into a mutiny, not with threats but with silence. As furious soldiers surrounded him, shouting grievances, he simply sat motionless on his horse, face as unreadable as a frozen lake. Within minutes, the men lowered their weapons, some even wept. This wasn't just discipline, it was the paradox of Stoic charisma in action. The quieter he became, the more power he radiated. Modern leadership gurus preach authenticity and vulnerability, but history's most magnetic rulers knew something counterintuitive. Sometimes the strongest connection is forged not by sharing emotions, but by mastering them. Take Frederick's famous tent meetings. While other monarchs bribed or berated their generals, he'd listen for hours without interrupting. then deliver one piercing observation that cut to the heart of the matter. Officers left these sessions not just obedient but awestruck, as if they'd been in the presence of a human lightning rod. Neuroscience now explains this phenomenon. When Princeton researchers analyzed brain scans during leadership interactions, they found that individuals who maintained steady eye contact and measured speech patterns triggered stronger mirror neuron responses in observers, essentially wiring others to mirror their calm. Frederick's restraint wasn't coldness, it was a neurological hack, yet Stoic charisma demands razor-thin precision. When King Louis XVI tried mimicking Frederick's detached demeanor during the French Revolution, his silence was read as weakness, not strength. The difference: Frederick's calm pulsed with latent energy like a sheathed sword still humming from recent battle. His soldiers sensed resolve beneath the restraint. Louis, by contrast, projected only uncertainty. This duality reveals the first rule of Stoic magnetism. Detachment inspires only when paired with undeniable competence. A leader who pauses before speaking seems wise unless the crowd suspects they're pausing because they have nothing to say. The psychological alchemy deepens when we examine Frederick's night marches. While other armies slept, he'd move troops through darkness with eerie discipline: no torches, no chatter. Survivors recalled not resentment, but a strange pride in enduring what others couldn't. Here lies Stoic charisma's secret sauce. It transforms austerity into exclusivity. Just as modern luxury brands cultivate desire through scarcity, Frederick made emotional restraint feel like an elite club. His soldiers didn't just follow orders, they competed to prove they belonged to his inner circle of the unshakable. Modern leaders might balk at this approach. In an era of TED Talks and viral vulnerability, Frederick's model seems archaic, but consider the CEOs who have mastered it. When Satya Nadella took over Microsoft, he didn't win over skeptics with tearful confessional. He did it by listening more than he spoke, then calmly dismantling objections with data. Or Angela Merkel, whose mutty persona blended maternal warmth with unbreakable poise during crises. Their power didn't come from emoting, but from making people lean in to catch every measured word. So can calmness be magnetic? The answer lies in a forgotten Stoic distinction between suppressing emotions and transcending them. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no time arguing what a good leader should be one," he wasn't advocating robotic detachment. He was describing the gravitational pull of a mind so focused on purpose that it leaves no room for performative angst. Frederick's soldiers didn't follow him despite his stillness, they followed him because of it. In a world of kings who screamed themselves hoarse, his silence became the most electrifying sound on the battlefield. Marcus Aurelius spent 17 years grooming Commodus to inherit Rome, 17 years of philosophy tutors, military campaigns at his side, and handwritten meditations on virtuous leadership. And yet, history remembers Commodus as the emperor who fought gladiators naked in the Colosseum while Rome burned. This wasn't just a father's failure, it was a Stoic paradox laid bare. How do rulers who have mastered detachment raise heirs in a system built on bloodlines? The answer lies in a brutal truth the Stoics understood. Dynasties don't collapse from lack of preparation, but from the inability to sever emotional ties when preparation fails. The philosopher emperor's private writings reveal his struggle. Pages meant to instruct Commodus alternate between stern maxims and heartbreaking pleas. Why must you chase the applause of charioteers when you were born to govern continents? Here was the architect of Stoic self-mastery, unable to apply his own principles to parenthood. Modern psychologists would recognize the pattern. High achievers often exempt their children from the harsh standards they impose on themselves. Byzantine Emperor Basil I avoided this trap by publicly disinheriting his eldest son for incompetence, declaring before the court, The throne is a scalpel, not a cradle. Harsh, absolutely, but it kept Byzantium stable for 2 more centuries. Family businesses today face identical dilemmas. Imagine a founder who built a billion-dollar empire through ruthless logic, only to hand the reins to an unqualified heir because blood is thicker than spreadsheets. The results are corporate graveyards littered with failed nepotism, from Ford's near collapse under Henry II to the Walmart heirs' succession battles. Contrast this with Warren Buffett's famous letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders. "I've instructed my trustees to hire a CEO who wasn't born with my DNA but was born with my temperament." That's Stoic succession planning in modern linen meritocracy enforced through emotional detachment. The key distinction: successful rulers treated heirs as contingency plans, not inevitabilities. When Queen Elizabeth I refused to name a successor until her deathbed, she wasn't being indecisive, she was preventing courtiers from flocking to the next in line like vultures. The Medici family operated similarly, testing multiple relatives in governance roles before selecting the most capable. Their private letters refer to potential heirs as vessels, a telling metaphor. You don't fall in love with a vessel, you assess its ability to hold water. Yet here's where Stoic logic clashes with human nature. Research on family firms shows that founders who emotionally detach too completely from succession create another danger: disengaged heirs with no passion for the legacy. The Habsburg dynasty perfected this imbalance, producing a line of technically competent but spiritually empty rulers who preserved their empire like museum curators rather than visionaries. The sweet spot, then, isn't indifference, it's what psychologists call detached concern. Frederick the Great captured it perfectly when mentoring his nephew. Love your family enough to want their success, but not so much you'll tolerate their mediocrity. So where does this leave modern leaders? Perhaps with a revision of Marcus Aurelius' famous maxim: waste no more time arguing what a good heir should be. Recognize one, because the ultimate test of Stoic leadership isn't how well you govern empires, it's whether you can walk away from them when the right successor isn't your reflection in the mirror. Epictetus faced the Roman rumor mill with a simple piece of advice that still cuts through modern noise. If someone told you a donkey spoke ill of you, would you demand an apology? His point wasn't about donkeys. It was about recognizing gossip for what it truly is: a powerless noise unless you grant it an audience. Ancient courts thrived on whispers just as social media feeds thrive on drama today. The difference: Stoics like Epictetus built psychological filters far more effective than any mute button. They practiced what neuroscientists now call cognitive distancing, training themselves to observe slander as if watching a play, interested but unaffected by the character's words. Consider the Byzantine court official who kept a blank scroll on his desk labeled "Insults Received." When rivals spread lies about him, he'd ceremoniously unroll it, pretend to write, then re-roll it untouched. This theatrical gesture wasn't just defiance, it reprogrammed his brain's threat response. Modern research validates the method. UCLA studies show that visualizing gossip as physical objects like scrolls reduces amygdala activation by 30%. Twitter users who mentally reframe hate tweets as digital paper airplanes report significantly less emotional distress. The technique's brilliance lies in its simplicity. By transforming abstract words into tangible objects, we gain power to discard them. This brings us to the Stoic 24-hour rule, a reaction delay protocol perfected in Renaissance Italy. Diplomats like Niccolò Machiavelli would place intercepted slanderous letters in a locked box overnight before responding. The cooling-off period served 2 purposes. It revealed whether the insult merited attention most didn't, and it prevented knee-jerk reactions that could escalate conflicts. Modern equivalents abound. Silicon Valley executives like Sheryl Sandberg advocate sleeping on it before responding to provocative emails. Political strategists store draft tweets in Google Docs for 24 hours, a practice that reportedly saved multiple careers during heated election cycles. The psychological mechanism here is fascinating. Harvard behavioral studies demonstrate that most perceived insults lose 70% of their emotional charge within 18 hours of non-response. Our brains evolved to prioritize immediate threats, but Stoics recognize that verbal attacks follow different rules. They expire like unclaimed baggage if left unattended. When Queen Elizabeth I faced rumors of illegitimacy, her advisors begged her to issue denials. Instead, she waited precisely 24 hours, by which time courtiers had already moved to fresher scandals. Her restraint turned the delay into a weapon. Soon, enemies stopped wasting energy on rumors they knew she'd never acknowledge. But Stoic gossip immunity wasn't passive silence. It was strategic engagement on one's own terms. Marcus Aurelius journaled privately about slanderers, then burned the pages, not to suppress anger, but to transmute it into fuel for self-improvement. Modern parallels emerge in block party rituals where influencers compile screenshots of hate comments, extract any valid criticism, then ceremonially delete the rest. The key distinction: they're controlling the narrative timeline, not letting detractors set the emotional agenda. So here's the challenge. Next time your phone buzzes with drama, whether a shady group chat or viral call-out post, open your Notes app and type 24HR followed by the incident's date. Then close it. If the issue still demands response tomorrow, address it with Epictetus filter. Does this concern what's mine to control? More often than not, you'll find the scroll stays blank, the box remains locked, and your mental court has better cases to try. Because the ultimate power move isn't winning the rumor mill's game. It's rewriting the rules so the mill grinds nothing but air. Cato the Younger walked through Rome's crowded forums dressed not in senatorial purple, but in a plain, unbleached tunic. No jewelry, no intricate embroidery, just coarse fabric that scratched against his skin. To onlookers, it seemed like eccentricity. To his rivals, it was a silent declaration of war. Because in a society where togas were canvases for status, Cato's austerity wasn't just personal preference, it was psychological warfare. His clothing screamed, "I cannot be bribed, flattered, or distracted." And it worked. When Julius Caesar, draped in exotic silks from conquered lands, tried to sway him with promises of wealth, Cato merely glanced at his own frayed sleeves and changed the subject. The message was clear: a man who needs nothing can't be controlled. This wasn't just ancient posturing. Modern neuroscience reveals why Cato's fashion strategy packed such a punch. Studies on enclothed cognition show that clothing doesn't just reflect our mindset, it actively shapes it. Wear a lab coat during a focus test, and your attention sharpens. Slip into a tailored suit before a negotiation, and your cortisol levels drop while confidence spikes. Cato intuitively grasped what scientists now quantify. Simplicity in dress creates a feedback loop of discipline. His rough tunic was a constant tactile reminder of his values, like a monk's hair shirt or a soldier's uniform. Every itch became a prompt to reaffirm his purpose. Fast forward to today's boardrooms where the power uniform follows the same Stoic logic. Steve Jobs' black turtlenecks weren't just a branding gimmick, they were decision fatigue armor. By eliminating trivial choices like outfit selection, he conserved mental energy for world-changing ideas. Mark Zuckerberg's gray t-shirt racks serve a similar function. What critics dismiss as billionaire eccentricity is actually high-stakes cognitive optimization. The fewer variables your brain processes about fabric or fit, the more bandwidth remains for strategy. But here's where ancient and modern diverge. While today's elites use minimalism for efficiency, the Stoics weaponized it for intimidation. When Cotto arrived at Senate debates looking like he'd slept in his clothes because he often had, it forced his silk-clad opponents onto the defensive. Their lavish attire, meant to project power, suddenly looked like desperate overcompensation. Psychologists call this costume confrontation bias. When someone's appearance clashes with expectations, observers instinctively question who's truly in control. That's why modern activists adopt Cotto's playbook. Picture Malala Yousafzai addressing the UN in her plain shawl while world leaders fidget in expensive suits. Her clothing isn't just cultural, it's a visual manifesto that says, "My ideas need no decoration." The wardrobe choices of history's most formidable figures reveal a pattern. The less you spend on appearances, the more you spend on impact. Byzantine Emperor Basil II wore the same battered breastplate for 30 years of conquests, letting its dents tell his story. Queen Elizabeth I's later portraits show her drowning in jewels not for vanity, but to physically embody her realm's wealth, every gem a calculated political statement. Even in rebellion, the principle holds. When revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they didn't dress as peasants. They wore stolen aristocratic coats inside out, transforming symbols of oppression into badges of defiance. So try this experiment. For 1 week, strip your wardrobe to its essentials, not as a fashion statement, but as a cognitive audit. Notice which interactions feel different when you're not hiding behind fabric armor. Observe how others respond when your clothing says, "I'm here to work, not impress." Because whether in ancient Rome or a Silicon Valley incubator, the most powerful outfit isn't the one that turns heads, it's the one that reminds you with every thread why you're dressed in the first place. Antoninus Pius ruled Rome at its zenith, yet history remembers his reign not for conquests or grand monuments, but for footsteps, countless pairs of leather sandals left anonymously at the doorsteps of the poor. The emperor who could have had his name chiseled onto every bridge and bathhouse instead conducted charity like a shadow passing through the city at dawn. His private letters reveal the philosophy behind this radical anonymity. When you do good and another praises you, the pleasure lies not in the act but in being seen. Strip that away, and what remains is either true virtue or empty theater. This was Stoic philanthropy distilled to its purest form, helping detached from the hunger for recognition, giving as naturally as the sun gives light without demanding gratitude. Modern psychology confirms the wisdom in his approach. Studies on helpers high reveal that anonymous acts of generosity trigger more sustained dopamine release than publicized ones, suggesting our brains are wired to find deeper satisfaction when no applause follows. The ancient Stoics intuited this centuries earlier. When Seneca funded scholarships for promising students from the slums, he insisted his name never appear on the rolls. "A gift wrapped in expectation is no gift at all," he wrote, "but a transaction waiting for its payment." Contrast this with today's social media charity streams where donation amounts flash across screens in real time. The difference isn't in the amount given, but in the spiritual weight carried by each coin. The brilliance of Stoic giving lies in its double purification. First, it scrubs clean the giver's motives, no longer a performance for others, but a private dialogue with one's principles. Second, it liberates the recipient from the crushing arithmetic of obligation. Byzantine archives tell of a noblewoman who secretly paid the dowries for 50 servant girls to marry freely. When one recipient tracked her down in tears, begging to know whom to thank, the woman responded, "Thank the universe that there was enough to share." That refusal to claim credit transformed a financial gift into something far more potent, an experience of grace untouched by power dynamics. Your challenge this week isn't about grand gestures, but silent ones. Pay for a stranger's groceries and vanish before they turn around. Leave a book and coffee on a park bench with a note saying, "For whoever needs this more." Send an anonymous gift card to a struggling coworker. The key isn't the amount, but the act of severing the thread between your hand and their gratitude. Like Antoninus' sandals appearing without explanation, let your help arrive as mysteriously as morning dew, a small reminder that goodness exists without price tags or pedigrees. Because the ultimate test of Stoic charity isn't whether the world knows you gave, but whether you can give without needing the world to know. When Elizabeth I rode through her kingdom on royal progresses, those extravagant summer tours where her entire court became a traveling circus, she wasn't just showing off her wealth. She was conducting a masterclass in Stoic adaptability. Imagine the chaos: hundreds of nobles, servants, and diplomats crammed into makeshift palaces, sleeping on unfamiliar beds, eating strange local dishes, all while maintaining the rigid decorum of court life. This wasn't a vacation, it was a discomfort pilgrimage designed to test her courtiers' resilience. Seneca's letters to Lucilius crackle with similar wisdom. Travel won't cure your restlessness if you carry your anxieties with you. The Elizabethan court took this literally. By voluntarily uprooting themselves annually, they practiced what modern psychologists call controlled discomfort exposure, the deliberate embrace of minor hardships to strengthen adaptability. Consider the logistics alone. A royal progress meant surrendering control over basic comforts, sleeping in manor houses with leaky roofs, enduring bumpy carriage rides on mud-choked roads, tolerating provincial customs that might offend aristocratic sensibilities. Yet Elizabeth insisted on these journeys long after she could have stayed safely in Whitehall. Why? Because she understood what Seneca meant when he wrote, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." Constant movement prevented her court from growing too comfortable in any single power center, while forcing them to confront the raw realities of their realm. A noble who complained about lumpy mattresses in Kent might suddenly appreciate the rebellion simmering among Kent's overtaxed farmers. This practice finds eerie echoes in modern executive training. Silicon Valley CEOs like Jeff Bezos famously institute mandatory discomforts, from working customer service calls to spending nights in fulfillment centers. The U.S. Navy SEALs drown-proofing exercises where trainees' bound hands and feet must survive underwater are just militarized versions of Seneca's advice. Throw yourself into unfamiliar circumstances and you'll learn to swim. But Elizabeth's progresses added a psychological twist. By making discomfort communal, she turned grumbling courtiers into bonded teams. Shared hardship, as any soldier knows, forges loyalty faster than shared luxury. Try your own version. Next vacation, resist the 5-star resort. Book a homestay where you'll eat what's served, sleep where there's space, and navigate without Google Maps. Notice how your mind initially rebels, then adapts. That friction point is where Stoic growth happens. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The obstacle is the way," he might as well have been describing the value of a terrible hotel shower. Because true resilience isn't built in comfort's embrace, but in the space between what we expect and what we receive, whether in a Tudor barn or a delayed flight. The royal road to self-mastery, it turns out, was always meant to be bumpy. Pericles stood before Athens not as its invincible leader, but as a grieving father. His infant sons had just perished in the same plague ravaging the city he governed. Yet when he removed his mourning wreath to address the public, his voice didn't crack with sorrow. It thundered. His eulogy for fallen soldiers wasn't a sterile recitation of duty. It was a raw, impassioned reminder of what made Athens worth dying for. This moment reveals Stoicism's best-kept secret. True detachment isn't about erasing emotion, but knowing precisely when to let it speak. Marcus Aurelius, the archetype of Stoic restraint, left cryptic instructions in his Meditations. Measure your vulnerability like a physician measures poison, and enough to heal, not enough to debilitate. He demonstrated this during Rome's darkest hours, allowing tears to fall for his dead children while refusing to cancel state functions. The lesson: emotional precision, not emotional absence. Modern psychology confirms this ancient intuition. Studies on strategic vulnerability show leaders who occasionally reveal human fragility, like Jacinda Ardern discussing parenting struggles during crises, build deeper trust than those projecting robotic calm. The key lies in control. Pericles didn't weep uncontrollably. He channeled grief into eloquence that unified a shattered city. History's greatest leaders recognized these exceptions. When Byzantine Emperor Justinian's reforms sparked riots, he didn't double down with icy decrees. He stood bareheaded in the hippodrome, his anguish visible as he shouted, "Must I rule over corpses?" The crowd's fury dissolved into shame. Contrast this with Tsar Nicholas II's infamous detachment during Russia's bread riots. His diary entry on the day his regime collapsed reads, "Played dominoes. Went to bed early." Stoicism's line isn't between emotion and logic, but between purposeful feeling and self-indulgence. The military world codifies this balance. Navy SEAL training permits even encourages tears during Hell Week, but only if they don't interrupt the mission. Ancient Sparta took it further. Warriors were expected to weep at funerals, then laugh during battles. This wasn't inconsistency, it was emotional marksmanship. Marcus Aurelius praised such discernment. A Stoic's tears should catch the light like sword strokes, brief, brilliant, and directed. So when does detachment become a liability? When it isolates you from the very people you lead. Elizabeth I's legendary golden speech worked because her calculated tremble, "I may not be a lion, but I am a lion's cub," made decades of steely rule feel human. Modern CEOs like Satya Nadella credit Microsoft's revival to moments where he swapped data slides for stories about his disabled son. These weren't breakdowns, but bridges built from shared fragility. The ultimate test: ask what emotion serves. Pericles' grief mobilized a city. Churchill's rage against Nazi tyranny galvanized a nation, but Napoleon's tantrums in Russia. Petty ego. Stoic detachment isn't a cage for your humanity, it's the scalpel that lets you operate with it. The boardroom murmurs with tension as the CEO enters, not with a clenched jaw or forced smile, but with the unsettling calm of a storm eye. This isn't just executive composure, it's the modern rebirth of Stoic detachment, where ancient royal tactics now play out in glass towers and Zoom calls. Consider the tech founder who receives news of a competitor's breakthrough with a slow nod instead of panic, mirroring Marcus Aurelius facing barbarian hordes. Or the influencer who reads scathing comments without flinching, echoing Byzantine envoys absorbing insults from rival courts. The weapons have changed from daggers to data breaches, but the psychological battlefield remains identical. Corporate emotional intelligence training often misrepresents Stoicism as robotic indifference, but history's shrewdest rulers would recognize today's power players who weaponize measured vulnerability, like the executive who shares a single personal struggle during earnings calls to humanize austerity measures. This isn't authenticity theater. It's the modern equivalent of Elizabeth I displaying calculated tears over national tragedies while privately strategizing. Neuroscience confirms why this works. brain scans show leaders who blend 90% composure with 10% vulnerability trigger 28% higher trust metrics in teams. The key lies in Seneca's distinction between showing feeling and being ruled by it. Social media has become the new royal court, where every post is a calculated audience with subjects and rivals. The most formidable profiles employ stoic curation, not the toxic positivity of forced smiles, but strategic silence, like Louis XI's spies who knew when to burn letters rather than respond. Modern influencers gain power by letting hate comments expire unanswered. A Stanford study tract accounts that practiced selective engagement, responding to only 3% of provocations. Their perceived authority scores doubled within 6 weeks. The lesson, digital detachment, isn't about ignoring criticism, but starving reckless attacks of the oxygen they crave. Beware the counterfeit stoicism of hustle culture. Ancient texts never praised suffering for its own sake. That's the distortion peddled by productivity gurus claiming sleep deprivation builds character. True Stoic discipline resembles Emperor Augustus' energy management, rising at dawn for deep work, taking afternoon walks to replenish creativity, and guarding leisure as fiercely as work hours. Your digital stoicism checklist starts with 3 filters adapted from Epictetus. First, is this notification within my control? Mute all that fail. Second, does reacting serve my purpose? Schedule response windows to bypass dopamine-driven urgency. Third, what would I gain by being offended? Bookmark this question for Inbox 0 sessions. The darkest modern twist, corporate wellness programs that rebrand emotional suppression as resilience training. When a manager praises employees for enduring burnout without complaint, they're repeating the mistake of Hadrian confusing numbness with strength. True Stoic workplaces emulate Antoninus Pius, setting realistic demands, then rewarding rest as seriously as results. A Berlin tech firm recently tested Stoic Fridays, no meetings, no deadlines, just focused work with afternoon philosophy discussions. Productivity spiked 19% while turnover vanished. Why? Because unlike ancient courts, modern institutions thrive when detachment isn't a survival tactic, but a shared language for sustainable focus. Your move isn't to mimic marble busts of indifferent philosophers, but to study the living tension in their writings. Marcus Aurelius journaled about wrestling with irritation. Seneca admitted to trembling before Nero's rages. Their wisdom wasn't in eliminating emotions, but in the milliseconds between trigger and response. The pause where you decide whether this email deserves your cortisol, that tweet your adrenaline. That space is your modern throne room. Guard it not with the coldness of a statue, but the precision of a surgeon knowing exactly when to let the blade drop and when to sheath it. Emotional detachment, when honed through Stoic practice, is often misunderstood as cold indifference, but history's greatest rulers reveal its true power. This isn't about shutting down feelings, it's about channeling them with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Seneca put it bluntly, a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than necessary. What sounds like resignation is actually liberation, the freedom to choose your battles instead of being dragged into every emotional skirmish. Marcus Aurelius took it further. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. These weren't platitudes scribbled in a notebook. They were survival strategies for men and women who navigated labyrinths of betrayal and power. The difference between manipulation and mastery lies in intention. Catherine de Médicie's calculated tears during political crises weren't just theater. They were tools to expose her enemies' weaknesses while shielding her true plans. Contrast that with Marcus Aurelius, who wept openly for his dead children yet still governed Rome through plague and war. Both wielded emotional control, but one sought to dominate, the other to serve. Stoicism at its highest level isn't a weapon to control others, it's armor to protect your purpose. When Elizabeth I famously said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," she wasn't denying her humanity. She was proving that true power comes from holding both strength and vulnerability without letting either rule you. Your challenge this week: borrow one tactic from history's Stoic courts. Start small, pause for 12 breaths before responding to a provoking email, mirroring the Byzantine diplomats who turned silence into leverage. Or try Antoninus Pius's anonymous generosity: leave a coffee for a stranger without waiting for thanks. Notice how detachment, practiced not as suppression but as focus, changes your interactions. Does the coworker who thrives on drama falter when you refuse to react? Does the family gossip quieten when you redirect the conversation with calm questions? So tell us in the comments, where's your modern court, the office? Social media, family gatherings, how could a dash of Stoic detachment reshape those battles? And if you're ready to go deeper, subscribe now, because in part 2, we're dissecting the exact rituals these rulers used to train their minds daily. From Marcus Aurelius's morning affirmations to Catherine the Great's crisis journals, you'll learn how to build resilience that lasts longer than any empire. The throne of self-mastery is empty. Will you take